Chapter 1. Bangkok. The first time I heard of the beach was in Bangkok, on the Khao San Road. Khao San Road was backpacker land. Almost all the buildings were guest houses for travellers on their way into or out of Thailand. It was a place between east and west. I'd landed in Bangkok from England in the late afternoon. As soon as the taxi dropped me on the Khao San Road, I caught the smell of dope. Half the travellers wandering past me were stoned. I found a cheap guest house easily, and a quarter of an hour later, I was settling into a room that was only slightly larger than a double bed. The walls were dirty and bare, and stopped before they reached the ceiling, so I could hear everything in the rooms on each side of me. On the ceiling was a fan, and for a while I just lay on the bed and looked up at it. It was calming, and the mixture of the heat and the gentle noise of the fan soon sent me to sleep. I slept deeply until I heard the man's footsteps in the corridor. They were different, too weird to sleep through. They dragged on the floor, and a stream of British swear words floated into my room as the man tried to unlock his door. Then his light came on, and frowning, I looked at my watch. It was 2 a.m, early evening in England, and I wondered if I would ever manage to get back to sleep. The man coughed. Then I heard him rolling a joint. Soon there was blue smoke caught in the light above the dividing wall. "Bitch," said a voice suddenly. "I could be dead." The voice paused while the man coughed. I was wide awake now. "Cancer in the coral, blue water, my beach. Nearly killed me," the man continued. He had an accent, but at first I couldn't think where he came from. "Beach," he said again, spitting out the word. A Scottish accent. Beach. Then suddenly the man's head appeared in the gap between my wall and the ceiling. "Hey," he said. I didn't move. I was sure he couldn't see me. "Hey, I know you're listening in there. I know you're awake. Here." Something sailed through the darkness and landed on my bed. The joint he'd been smoking. I grabbed it to stop it burning the sheets. Holding up the joint, I asked, "Do you want this back?" "You were listening," he replied, ignoring me. "You heard me talking about the beach. Tell me what you heard." "I didn't hear anything." "You're lying. You were listening," he shouted. I thought he was going to shout at me all night, but he suddenly seemed to change his mind, and his head disappeared. I heard him light another joint, and then he switched off his light. I hardly slept for the rest of the night, and went downstairs to the eating area early to get some breakfast. When I got back to my room, I found an envelope pinned to my door. On it was written, "Here is the map." A couple of minutes later, I was sitting on my bed with the ceiling fan cooling the back of my neck, and the map in my hands. It was carefully drawn and beautifully coloured in. At the top of the map were the words Gulf of Thailand in thick red ink. Below them were several small islands. On one of them I noticed a black mark, an X. I looked closer. Written underneath in tiny letters was the word beach. The man in the next room. He must have pinned the map on my door. I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to say to him. I was curious, that's all. I just wanted to know what was so special about this beach. His door was unlocked. I listened outside for a minute before knocking, and when I did, the door swung open. It was dark in the room, but there was just enough light for me to see. The man was lying on the bed, looking up at the ceiling. I think he'd cut his wrists. Or it could have been his neck. In the dark, with so much blood splashed about, it was hard to tell what he'd cut. But I knew he'd done the cutting. There was a knife in his hand. I stood still, staring at the body for a couple of minutes. Then I went to get help. The policeman was sweating, but not with the heat. It was the effort of speaking English. When he came to a difficult word or a complicated sentence, he would stop and wipe the sweat from his forehead. "Mr. Duck, your friend, yes?" he asked. I shook my head. I'd never met him before last night. And listen, Daffy Duck can't be his real name. It's a joke name. "Joke name?" said the policeman. "Not a true name," I explained. Daffy Duck is a character in a children's film, like Bugs Bunny or Mickey Mouse. "Ah, so dead man gives false name to guest house," said the policeman when he finally understood what I was saying. "Okay, last night, in hotel, tell me again." I didn't tell the policeman about the map. I didn't want to get involved in a police investigation and spoil my holiday. I don't think the policeman cared about the dead man much anyway, because after about 30 minutes, he let me go. As I left the police station, I saw a French boy who I'd met in the guest house at breakfast. He and his girlfriend, Françoise, had a room on the other side of the dead man's, and they'd been brought to the police station for questioning too. I sat down next to Etienne in the sun on the steps of the police station. The death was an unusual start to the day, and I needed to talk to someone about it. "Hi," I said. "Do you speak English?" "Hi. Yeah, sure. I speak English. You're the one who found the dead guy, aren't you?" "Yes, I found him this morning," I said, pulling my cigarettes out of my pocket. "Do you smoke?" "No, thanks. My name's Etienne, by the way." "I'm Richard," I said, and we shook hands. This is so weird. I only arrived in Thailand last night. I wanted to relax in Bangkok, if that's possible, and instead I found a dead man. Well, we've been here for 4 weeks, but it's weird for us too. So where have you been for the last month? Not only in Bangkok, surely? Oh no, we've been in the north, Chiang Mai, walking in the hills and rafting on a river. Very boring, no? Boring? I asked, surprised. Yeah, I wanted to do something different. All travellers want to do something different, but in the end, we all do the same thing. There's no, adventure? Yes. We come to Thailand for an adventure, but all we find is this, he said, pointing down the Khao San road. This dead man, he continued after a few seconds. He was very strange. He used to talk about a beach every night. I know where the beach is, I said. Etienne looked interested. I've got a map. He drew it for me. I found it pinned to my door this morning. It shows where the beach is and how to get there. I've got it in my room. Did you tell the police? Etienne asked. No, I didn't want to get involved. Maybe they'd think I knew him or something, but I didn't. I'd never met him before last night. A map, said Etienne quietly. Cool. Can I see it? Yeah, sure. But what about your girlfriend? She's still with the police, isn't she? Françoise? Oh, she'll be all right. She knows the way back to the guest house. OK then, I said. Let's go. When we got back to my room, Etienne stared at the map for 5 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "Wait," and ran out of the room. He came back holding a guidebook. "There," he said, pointing to an open page. "These are the islands on the map. They're in a national marine park west of Koh Samui and Koh Phangan. All the islands are protected. Tourists aren't allowed to visit them. They can go to one, Koh Pelong, on a special guided tour from Koh Samui, but they can only stay one night, and they can't leave the island." "So Mr. Duck's beach is in a national park. How do people get there?" I asked. "They can't get there. That's the point." I leant back on my bed and lit a cigarette. "Well, Mr. Duck's map is rubbish then." Etienne shook his head. "No, not rubbish. Why do you think the man drew it so carefully and gave it to you?" "He was crazy. He called himself Daffy Duck," I laughed. "I don't think he was mad. Maybe travellers try to get to new islands in the national park because islands like Koh Samui and Koh Phangan are spoilt. Too many tourists." "But they aren't allowed in the national park," I said. Etienne raised his eyes to the ceiling. "Exactly. That's why they go there. You know, Richard, I'd like to find this beach." I smiled. "Really?" said Etienne. "Believe me." I did believe him. He had a look in his eyes that I recognised. He wanted an adventure. I could tell that he was already listening to the sound of the waves on this idyllic beach, or hiding from the marine park guides as he made his way to the island. At that moment, Françoise arrived. She was one of the most attractive girls I'd ever seen. I didn't want to seem impressed by her looks, so when she put her head round the door, I just looked up, said hi, then went back to studying the map. Etienne spoke to her quickly in French. I couldn't follow the conversation, but I recognised a few words, including my own name once or twice. I think she was annoyed that he'd left the police station without her. After some minutes, their voices relaxed. Then Françoise said, "May I have a cigarette, Richard?" "Sure." I gave her one and held out a light. "So, what's this map then?" she asked. "I found it on my door," I started to explain. "Yes, Etienne's already told me. Can I see it?" I passed the map to her, and Etienne pointed out the beach. "Just a short boat ride from Koh Pelong," he said. "How do we know what we'll find there?" Françoise asked. "We don't," I replied. "And if there's nothing there, how do we get back to Koh Samui?" "We get back to Koh Pelong," said Etienne. "Then we wait for a tourist boat. We say we were lost. It'll be fine." "I see. OK. When are we leaving then?" I looked at Etienne, and he looked back at me. "I'm tired of Bangkok," Françoise continued. "Let's get the night train south tonight." "Yeah, but," I said slowly, surprised by the speed at which events were developing. "We're going," said Françoise, and put out her cigarette on the floor as if that was the end of the discussion. And it was. We took the night train south from Bangkok first class. I didn't feel able to relax until I was in bed on the train, away from Etienne and Françoise. Things had been awkward since leaving the guest house. I had no objection to their company, but I was beginning to think about the reality of our plans. Also, I realised that we were complete strangers, something I'd forgotten in the excitement of our quick decision to find the beach together. I'm sure they were feeling the same, which was why they were as quiet as I was. At Surat Thani, we got off the train and took a bus to Donsak. From there, we caught the Songserm ferry straight to Narton. That was how we got to the tourist island of Koh Samui. Chapter 2. Koh Samui. A bus from the Koh Samui port took us to the Chaweng beach resort. On the left, the sea lay blue between rows of coconut trees, and on the right, a jungle-covered slope rose steeply. The bus left us outside a decent-looking bunch of beach huts. Private showers, a bedside fan, and a restaurant that looked onto the sea. Our huts faced each other over a path lined with tropical flowers. First, I went for a swim. That way I could get clean and get a suntan. I ran down to the sea, partly because the sand was so hot, and partly because I always run into the sea. I'd been splashing around in the water for about 15 minutes when Etienne and Françoise came down to join me. Françoise looked lovely in a white swimsuit. I wondered if Etienne noticed her beauty, or whether he'd got used to it. "Will you come for a swim?" she asked. "I am swimming, aren't I?" "No," said Etienne, pointing to the open sea. "She means a real swim, out there." We played a game as we swam out. Every 10 metres, we would each dive to the bottom of the sea and return with a handful of sand. I found the game strangely unpleasant. A metre underwater, the warmth of the tropical sea would stop, and it would suddenly turn cold. The further we swam, the blacker and finer the sand became. Soon, the water at the bottom became too dark for me to see anything, and I could only kick out blindly with my legs until my hands sank into the sand. "How far out shall we go?" I asked, when the sunbathers on the beach behind us looked like insects. Etienne smiled. "You would like to go back now?" "You are tired, Richard?" Françoise asked, eyebrows raised. "We can go back." "I'm fine," I replied. "Let's swim further." At 5 that afternoon, the temperature cooled. The sky turned black, and it rained heavily. I sat outside my hut, under the roof, watching the storm. After some time, 2 guys came racing up the beach, laughing and shouting. They ran up to the hut next to mine. "Man!" one of them shouted. "What a storm! Whoop!" Americans, I thought. They tried to get into their hut, but the door was locked. "Lost our key," the guy with white blonde hair shouted at me. "Can't get in." I nodded. "Bad luck. Where did you lose it?" "Down the beach, man. A long way from here." "Hey, can we come and sit with you? You want to smoke a joint?" "Sure," I said. "Excellent!" The 2 of them ran over to my hut and introduced themselves. "I'm Sammy," said the one with white blonde hair. "And this is Zeph. Cool name, huh?" "Definitely," I answered as we shook hands. Sammy started rolling a joint. We smoked and chatted and watched the lightning out at sea. They made me laugh with their funny jokes and stories. After a while, we were too stoned to do anything except sit in silence and listen to the thunder. An hour or 2 after dark, a tiny Thai woman came over from the restaurant and gave Zeph a spare key to their hut. As I stood up to say goodnight, Sammy said, "Hey, nice meeting you. See you tomorrow, man." "Sure," I said, and shut my door behind me. The next morning, the sky was still cloudy. Rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I walked over the cool sand to the restaurant and found Etienne and Françoise eating breakfast. I ordered a fruit salad and sat down with them. "Who did you meet last night?" asked Etienne as I pulled up a chair. "We saw you talking outside your hut." I pulled out a cigarette to kill time before breakfast arrived. "A couple of Americans, Zeph and Sammy." Francoise nodded. "Did you tell them about our beach?" "No." I lit my cigarette. "I didn't." "You shouldn't tell people about our beach." "I didn't tell them." "It should be a secret." "That's why I didn't tell them, Francoise," I answered. Etienne interrupted, smiling nervously. "She was worried you might have—" "I didn't even think of it," I replied, annoyed, and put out my cigarette hard. When breakfast came, I made an effort to relax and told them some of the Americans' jokes. Francoise thought they were extremely funny. Her laughter improved the atmosphere, and we began making plans for the day ahead. We decided that we had to hire a boat. We couldn't hire one from the normal travel agencies because tourists weren't allowed to go to the islands in the marine park. Instead, we would need to find a fisherman who was unaware or unconcerned about the marine park rules. After breakfast, we set off up the beach. It didn't take us long to find a fisherman who agreed to take us to the marine park. "That can be arranged," he said, smiling at us. "Of course, yes. Not difficult for me to do that." He looked at the map in Etienne's guidebook. "Actually, my friend, your book is not correct. You can stay Copelong 1 night, 2 nights is okay, but this island, you can only stay 1 night. He took Etienne's book and pointed to an island close to Copelong. Etienne looked at me and smiled. From my memory of Mr. Duck's map, the island that the fisherman was pointing at was next to our beach island. "Okay," said Etienne, "but we want to stay more than 1 night. That is possible?" The fisherman looked over his shoulder. "Yes," he whispered, "but it's more money. You understand?" Etienne and the fisherman eventually agreed a price for the boat ride, and we arranged to meet him at 6 the next morning in the restaurant. He would take us to the island next to our beach island, and 3 nights later he would collect us and bring us back to Koh Samui. That left us with a couple of problems. How were we going to get to our beach island? And if we did manage to get there, we would be missing when the fisherman came to collect us. Etienne and Francoise seemed much less concerned about these problems than I was. They had a simple solution to the first problem. We would swim. By examining Mr. Duck's map and the map in their guidebook, they decided that the islands were about 1 kilometre apart. According to them, we could swim that distance. I wasn't so confident, remembering the diving game from the day before. The tide had pulled us a long way down Chaweng Beach as we swam. If the same thing happened between the islands, the length of the swim could double. Sunset was marvellous that evening. Etienne, Francoise and I were lying on the beach watching the red sky gently fading to deep blue when Zeph and Sammy came over to join us. We all got stoned together and went on watching the changing colours in the sky as if we were watching television. "Hey," Zeph said, waking us from our dreams. "Have you heard the story about the beach?" I shook my head. "An amazing beach hidden somewhere, but no one knows where it is." "No," I said, "we haven't. Tell us." "Okay," said Zeph, and lay back on the sand. "Close your eyes and think about a lagoon, hidden from the sea and passing boats by a high, curving wall of rock. Then imagine idyllic white sands and coral gardens, waterfalls surrounded by thick jungle, plants untouched for 1,000 years, strangely coloured birds and monkeys in the trees. On the white sands, fishing in the coral gardens, is a select group of travellers. They leave if they want to. They return. The beach never changes." "Select?" I asked quietly, as if talking through a dream. Zeph's vision was magical. "Special," he replied. "Only a few lucky travellers know where this beach is." It's paradise, Sammy whispered. Paradise, Zeph agreed, is what it sounds like. Francoise suddenly stood up. She was very worried that Zeph and Sammy knew about the beach. "Now," she said, dusting sand off her legs, "we leave early tomorrow morning for Comprehension, so I think we shall eat and go to bed now. Etienne, Richard, come." "Huh?" I said. "Francoise, it's only 7:30 in the evening." "We leave early in the morning," she repeated. "Good night, Sammy and Zeph. It was very nice meeting you. And really, your beach, what a silly story." She laughed loudly. We said goodbye to Sammy and Zeph, and all shook hands awkwardly. Then Etienne and I followed Francoise. The atmosphere at dinner was very tense, but Francoise knew she'd behaved foolishly. When we said goodnight, she apologised. "I don't know why, but I was suddenly frightened they would want to come with us," she explained. "I only wanted to be us. Do you think they have realised we know about the beach?" "Hard to say," I answered. "Everyone was stoned." Etienne nodded. "Yes," he said, and put his arm around Francoise's shoulder. "Everyone was stoned. We should not worry." It took me a long time to get to sleep that night. It wasn't just because I was anxious about what might happen tomorrow. I was also troubled by the hurried way I'd said goodbye to Zeph and Sammy. I'd enjoyed their company, and our parting had been too quick and awkward, too confused by dope and secrets. I felt there was something I'd left unsaid. In the cool early morning, I got up and quickly drew Zeph and Sammy a map. There wasn't time to draw it as carefully as Mr. Duck had. The islands were rough circles, and there were only 3 labels: Koh Samui, Koh Pulong, and Paradise. At the bottom of the page I wrote, "Wait on Cha Weng for 3 days. If we haven't come back by then, it means we made it to the beach. See you there, Richard." I crept outside and slipped the map under Zeph and Sammy's door. Then I got my backpack, locked my hut, and went to the restaurant to wait for Etienne and Francoise. Chapter 3. Journey to Paradise. The morning sun played tricks in the sea. Gold shapes like fish spun beneath the surface. Sitting in the fisherman's yellow and white motorboat on our way to the island, I reached down and put my hand in the water. The fish swam in and out of my fingers. I looked back at Koh Samui. Strangely, it seemed far behind us, but the island we were going to still appeared as distant as it had an hour ago. I didn't move again until the water turned blue, and I saw a coral bed beneath the boat. The fisherman turned off the engine. "Now you pay," he said, as we slid towards the shore of the island. A few minutes later, I sat on the beach and watched the fisherman's boat slowly disappear into the distance, on its way back to Koh Samui. A few meters away, Etienne was studying the map. He was trying to work out which of the several islands near us was our beach island, the one we had to swim to. He didn't need my help, so I called to him that I was going to take a walk. I'd never been on a real desert island before, a deserted desert island, and I felt I ought to explore. "Don't be long," Etienne said. "We should leave after lunch. We should not spend the night here." I started walking along the coast, looking for a place to turn inland. I eventually found some shady trees on the edge of a forest and sat down to smoke a cigarette. Thinking about Thailand often makes me angry, and until I started writing this book, I tried not to do it. I preferred it to stay hidden in the back of my mind. But I did think about Thailand sometimes, usually late at night. At those times, I made an effort to remember sitting under those trees, smoking my cigarette. I chose this moment because it was the last time I could remember being me, normal, nothing much going through my head apart from how pretty the island was and how quiet. It's hard to explain. I've been relying on an idea that these things would become clear to me as I wrote them down. It doesn't seem to be happening. When I got back to the beach, I found Etienne making lunch. I looked around. "Where's Françoise?" I asked. "She went to see how far it is to our island." When she came back, Françoise said our island was 1 kilometre away. To me, it just looked like a long swim. "Are you sure we can do this?" I said, more to myself than anyone else. "We can," said Françoise. "We can try," Etienne corrected her. We each took a few essential things from our backpacks and put them in strong plastic bags. The idea was that the bags would float on the water as we swam. They were strong enough to lean on, so we only had to swim with our legs. Then we hid our backpacks under some bushes. At 3:45, we were ready to leave. As we started to swim, I heard Françoise say behind me, "Maybe more than 1 kilometre." Etienne said something in reply, but it was lost as a wave broke. The swim passed in stages. The first was full of confidence, chatting and making jokes about sharks. Then, as our legs began to ache, we stopped talking. The jokes about sharks became fears, and I started to doubt that I had the strength to finish the swim. We were about halfway between the two islands. Not being able to finish the swim would mean dying. And then, strangely, things became easier. My legs seemed to kick automatically, allowing my mind to move beyond the pain. I was just thinking that I should try to pass my driving test if I got back to England, when I saw some wood on the beach ahead and realised we were nearly there. When we reached the beach, we all fell exhausted onto the wet sand. "We've done enough," I said. "We're staying here tonight." "But our special beach may be close, no?" said Etienne. "Shh." We set off immediately after breakfast. According to Mr. Duck's map, the beach we were looking for was on the other side of the island. At first, we walked along the coast, but the sand soon turned to sharp rocks. We realised we would have to go inland and find our way through the jungle. The first 200 or 300 metres from the shore were the hardest. The spaces between the trees were covered with strange bushes with small leaves that sliced our legs like razors. But as we got further inland and the ground began to rise, there were fewer plants on the forest floor, and we found animal tracks that we could follow. After 2 hours of walking, we found ourselves at the bottom of a particularly steep slope. Etienne was the first to reach the top. "Hurry up!" he called enthusiastically. "It is amazing!" I climbed to the top next, leaving Françoise far behind. The slope led up to a shelf the size of a football pitch on the mountainside, so flat and neat that it seemed unnatural compared to the surrounding jungle. Etienne was ahead of me, standing in some bushy plants that looked familiar. "Cool," I said. "Dope." Etienne grinned. "Have you ever seen so much?" "Never." I pulled a few leaves from the nearest bush. "We should pick some, Richard. We can dry it in the sun and—" Then he stopped. "Wait a moment. There is something funny here." "What?" "Well, it is just so... These plants." His face turned white. "This is a field." I froze. "But it can't be a field. I mean, these islands are... The plants are in rows." We stared at each other. We are in deep trouble. Just then, Francoise appeared, calling out to us. "Hey, I've seen some people further up the mountain. They are coming this way. Maybe they are from our beach, no?" I ran towards her. "Shut up," I said, putting my hand over her mouth. "This is a dope field. Do you understand?" Lying flat on the earth, looking through the leaves, we listened to the Thai voices getting closer and waited for people to appear. A man stepped into the field. He was young, maybe 20. His chest was bare, and we could see his strong muscles. He wore military trousers and held a gun in his hand. A second man appeared, also with a gun. They stopped and exchanged a few words. Then another man came out from the jungle and they set off again, down the slope we'd just climbed up. 2 or 3 minutes after their voices had faded away, Francoise suddenly burst into tears. Then Etienne started crying too. I watched the two of them blankly. The shock of discovering the fields and the tension while we'd been hiding had left me feeling empty. Finally, I managed to say, "Okay, we've got to leave. They might come back soon and find us." "Richard," said Etienne, "I do not want to die here. You must get us out." "I must get them out? Me?" I couldn't believe my ears. But just by looking at him, I could tell he wasn't going to take control of the situation. And neither was Francoise. She was staring at me with the same scared expression as Etienne. So, having no choice, it was me who took the decision to go on. I have almost no memory of the few hours after leaving the dope field. I think I was concentrating so hard on our immediate survival as we made our way down the other side of the mountain that I can't remember anything until we reached the waterfall. It was the height of a 4-story building, the kind of height I hate to stand upright near, so I crawled to the cliff edge on my stomach. On either side of the waterfall, the cliff continued, eventually curving around into the sea, then, unbroken, rejoining the land on the far side. It was as if a huge circle had been cut out of the island to form a lagoon in a wall of rock, just as Zeph had described. From where we sat, we could see that the cliffs were no more than 30 metres thick, but a passing boat could never guess what lay behind them. The water in the lagoon was presumably supplied by underwater caves and channels. The waterfall dropped into a pool from which a quick-flowing stream ran into the trees. Getting down into the pool was the problem. "I think we've definitely found the right place," I said to Etienne and Francoise as I crawled back from the cliff edge. "It's where Mr. Duck's map says it is, and it fits Zeph's description perfectly." "Richard, there must be a way down, no?" said Francoise. "If people go to the beach, there must be a way." "If people go to the beach," I echoed. We hadn't seen any sign that people were down there. The beach looked beautiful, but completely deserted. "Maybe we can jump from the waterfall," said Etienne. I thought for a moment. "Possibly," I replied. I crawled back to the cliff edge and looked down at the pool. I stood up cautiously. "Okay," I whispered to myself. "Are you jumping?" called Etienne nervously. "Just taking a better look," I called back. "So jump," I heard my voice say. I paused, wondering if I'd heard myself correctly, and then I did. I jumped. Everything happened as things are supposed to happen while one falls. I had time to think. Stupid things flashed through my head, like how my cat slipped off the kitchen table once and landed on its head. Then I hit the pool. It was so deep, I never even touched the bottom. "Ha!" I shouted, not caring who might hear. "I'm alive!" I looked up and saw Etienne and Francoise's heads looking over the cliff. "You are okay?" called Etienne. "I'm fine! I'm brilliant! Throw down the plastic bags!" I sat on the grass and waited for Etienne and Francoise to jump. The man appeared just as I was lighting a cigarette. He walked out of the trees a few meters away from me. His skin was deeply sunburnt, and he was wearing nothing except a pair of old blue shorts and a necklace made of seashells. He had a full beard, which made it hard to tell his age, but I didn't think he was much older than me. "Hey," he said with his head on one side. "You did the jump quickly for a newcomer." His accent was English. "It took me over an hour, but I was alone, so it was harder." Over the sound of the waterfall, Etienne's voice called to me, saying he was going to jump. He wouldn't have been able to see the man. I didn't bother to answer him. When Etienne and Francoise had both jumped, we followed the man through the trees. We didn't talk much as we walked. The only thing he would tell us was his name, Jed. He wouldn't answer the rest of our questions. "Easier to talk at the camp," he explained. "We've got as many questions for you as you've got for us." At first glance, the camp was like I'd imagined it might be. There was a large, dusty clearing surrounded by trees, with some huts and a few tents. At the far end was a larger building, a longhouse, and beside it the stream from the waterfall reappeared. I only noticed after looking at all this that there was something strange about the light. It was more like dusk than midday. I looked up, following the trunk of one of the huge trees. The lower branches had been cut away, but higher up the branches began to grow again, curving upwards over the clearing until they joined with the branches from the other side. They had formed a ceiling of wood and leaves over the clearing. "We don't want to be seen from the air," Jed explained. "Planes sometimes fly over. Not often, but sometimes." He pointed upwards. "Originally, the branches were tied together with ropes, but now they just grow that way. Clever, huh?" "Amazing," I agreed. I was so busy looking up that I didn't even notice that people had begun to come out of the longhouse and were walking across the clearing towards us. 3 people, to be exact. 2 women and a man. "Sal, Cassie, and Bugs," said one of the women in an American accent as they reached us. "I'm Sal, but don't try to remember our names." She smiled warmly. "You'll only get confused when you meet the others, and you'll learn them all eventually." I'm not likely to forget a name like Bugs, I thought to myself, managing not to laugh. I frowned and put a hand up to my forehead. Since jumping off the waterfall, my head had been feeling increasingly light. Now it had started to feel like it might float off my shoulders. Francoise stepped up to the woman and said, "Francoise, Etienne, and Richard." "You're French. Lovely. We've only got one other French person here." "Richard is English," Francoise said, pointing at me, and I tried to nod politely. "Lovely," said the woman again, watching me curiously out of the corner of her eye. "Well, I know you're all hungry, so let's get you some food." She turned to the man. "Bugs, can you make some soup? Then we can all have a long chat and get to know each other. Does that sound good?" "It sounds great, Sal," I said loudly. "You know, you're quite right. I do feel hungry. We've only eaten—" Jed ran to catch me as I fainted, but too late. As I fell backwards, the last thing I saw was a tiny bit of blue sky through the leafy ceiling. Then darkness rushed in. Late morning, I guessed. Only from the heat. In the darkness of the longhouse and the steady light of the candle, there was nothing else to reveal the time. The woman called Sal sat at the foot of my bed. She was wearing a yellow t-shirt, and her long hair was tied back from her face. Around her neck was a necklace of seashells. "Finish it, Richard," she said, looking at the bowl of fish soup that I held in my hands. I lifted the bowl to my mouth, then put it down again. "I can't, Sal." "You must, Richard. You've had a bad fever." "I've finished most of it. Look." I held up the bowl. "Okay," she said, then folded her arms. "Richard, we need to talk." We were alone in the longhouse. Occasionally I heard people enter and leave, but I couldn't see them. As I spoke, Sal didn't interrupt me, frown, smile, or nod. She just sat on the floor and listened. Soon I found myself talking to her as if she were a tape recorder or a priest. I told her everything that had happened since I arrived in Bangkok. When I told her about finding Mr. Duck's body, she looked sad. The only thing I didn't mention was that I'd given 2 other people directions to the island. I knew I should tell her about Zeph and Sammy, but I also thought she might be angry if she knew I'd spread the secret. Better to wait until I knew more about the camp and the other people who lived here. At the end of my story, she smiled. "Well, Richard, it sounds like you had quite an adventure getting here." I waited for her to continue, but she didn't. Now can I ask you some questions, Sal?" I said quickly. "I have some things to do, Richard," she said, standing up. "Just a few questions." She sat down again. "Okay, 5 minutes. Well, first, I'd just like to know something about this place. I mean, what is it?" "It's a beach resort, a place to come for vacations." I frowned. A beach resort? I felt so disappointed. I was a traveller, not a tourist. "What did you think this place was?" asked Sal. "I don't know. I didn't think anything, really. But I certainly didn't think it was just a beach resort." Sal waved a hand in the air. "Well, okay, Richard. Of course this is more than a beach resort. We come here to relax by a beautiful beach, but it isn't a beach resort because we're trying to get away from those sorts of places. Or we're trying to make a place that won't turn into one. See?" "No." "You will see, Richard. It's not complicated." "How about the gunmen in the dope fields?" I asked. "Are they anything to do with you?" Sal shook her head. "I have a feeling the fields are owned by ex-fishermen from Koh Samui, but I could be wrong. They came to that half of the island a couple of years ago. We can't go there now." "But they know you're here." "Of course, but there isn't much they can do. They can't report us. If the Marine Park authorities came to look for us, they'd find them too." "One more question," I said, as she stood up to go. "The man in Bangkok, Mr. Duck, you knew him?" "Yes," she said quietly, then began walking away. "He was a friend." "But, okay, just one more question. Where's the toilet?" "Outside, second hut along by the edge of the camp," she said, as she left the longhouse. When I went outside, I counted 9 tents in the clearing and 5 huts, not including the longhouse. The tents were only used for sleeping, but the huts all seemed to have different uses. Apart from the toilet, there was a kitchen and a washing area. The other huts were used for storing things. One contained carpentry tools and another some boxes of tinned food. As I wandered around the clearing, I found it strange that the camp was so deserted. Where was everybody? Where were my friends, Etienne and Françoise? I began to feel a little lonely and sorry for myself, so I decided to get out of the clearing and try to find them. By good luck, the path I chose led directly to the beach. I'd walked a few hundred metres when I noticed some people splashing around in the sea near one of the large rocks. At last I'd found someone. As I got nearer, I saw that there were 6 swimmers fishing with spears. They seemed to be catching a lot of fish. When they came out of the water onto the beach, none of the group noticed me. I had to stand there for a few moments, waiting for one of them to look up. Etienne finally saw me. "Richard, you are better!" He raced over to me. "Everybody, this is our friend who was ill." "Hi, Richard," the swimmers said. I was introduced to all of them. Moshe, a tall Israeli guy with a loud laugh. 2 Yugoslav girls whose names I could never pronounce and certainly never spell. And then Gregorio, who I liked at once. He had a kind face and a soft Latin accent. As we walked back along the beach, Etienne told me about what I'd missed while I'd had a fever. Then Gregorio came up to me. "You feel a bit strange with all these new people?" "Oh, yeah, a bit. These first days are difficult, of course, but do not worry. You will find friends quickly, Richard." I smiled. The way he spoke made me feel a lot better. When we got back to the camp, it was full of people. A fat guy was busy preparing fish outside the kitchen hut. Beside him, a girl blew on a wood fire. Most of the people were just walking around the clearing, chatting. Gregorio was right. I did feel strange, a bit like a new boy in school. As I looked around, I wondered which of the faces would become my friends. Chapter 4. Beach Life. After that first day, wandering around the clearing, I didn't really question a single thing about the beach. I soon felt like I'd been living there all my life. Koh Samui became a dreamlike place, and I couldn't remember anything about Bangkok. On the 3rd or 4th day, I remember thinking that Zeph and Sammy might arrive soon and wondering how people would react. Then I realised I couldn't quite remember what Zeph and Sammy looked like. A couple of days later, I'd forgotten they might be coming at all. Routines developed quickly. I'd wake up at about 7:30 and go straight down to the beach for a swim with Etienne and another guy called Kitty. Then we'd go back to the camp and wash the sea salt off our bodies in the shower hut. Breakfast was at 8. Every morning, the people doing the cooking would boil a lot of rice, and it was each individual's responsibility to cook anything else they wanted. Most people had their rice plain, but a few made the effort to boil some fish or vegetables. I never bothered. After breakfast, people would separate. Mornings were for working, and everybody had a job to do. By 9, the camp was always empty. There were 4 main areas of work: fishing, gardening, cooking, and carpentry. Etienne, Françoise and I were in a fishing group. When we'd arrived, there'd been 2 fishing groups, but we made it 3. We were in one group with Gregorio. Moshe and the 2 Yugoslav girls were in another, and the last group was 3 Swedish guys called Carl, Sten and Christo. They were very serious about their fishing, and every day they'd swim through the caves in the cliff to the open sea. I felt lucky to be working in the fishing group. If Etienne and Françoise hadn't volunteered to go fishing on the first day, we might have had to do gardening or cooking. Those jobs didn't appeal to me. If there was a leader in the camp, it was Sal. When she talked, People listened. She spent her days walking around, checking that people were working properly. At first, she spent a lot of time making sure we were settling in okay. After the first week, she seemed satisfied, and we rarely saw her during the work period. The only person who didn't have a clear job was Jed. He spent his days alone and was usually the first person to leave in the mornings and the last person to come back. Keaty said that Jed spent a lot of time near the waterfall and above the cliffs. Sometimes he would disappear and spend the night somewhere on the island. When he came back, he usually had some fresh dope, obviously taken from the dope fields. At about 2:30, people would start coming back to camp. The cooks and fishers would always be first so they could start preparing the fish. Then the gardeners would arrive with their vegetables and fruit, and by 3, the clearing would be full again. Breakfast and dinner were the only meals of the day. Dinner was at 4 o'clock, and people usually went to bed about 9. There wasn't much to do after dark, apart from getting stoned. Nighttime campfires weren't allowed because low planes could see them, even through the leafy ceiling. Except for the people with tents, everybody slept in the longhouse. It took me a while to get used to sleeping with 21 other people, but soon I started enjoying it. There was a strong sense of closeness in the longhouse. Often, just as people were going to sleep, a voice from somewhere in the darkness would say, "Night, Frankie." Then there'd be a short pause while we waited for someone else to say, "Night, Sal," or Gregorio or Bugs, or anyone they felt like saying goodnight to. Then the named person would have to say goodnight to someone different, and it would go around the whole longhouse until everyone had been mentioned. No one's name was ever forgotten. On the morning of my 4th Sunday, everyone from the camp was down on the beach. Nobody worked on Sundays. The tide was out, so there was a large area of sand between the trees and the sea. Sal had organised a huge game of football. Nearly everyone was playing, but not me and Keaty. We were sitting on a rock chatting. After a while, I stood up. "Feel like a swim?" I asked. "Sure. We could swim over to the coral. I haven't seen it yet." I swam down to the seabed and sat on the sand. Then I rested some stones on my lap so I wouldn't float back up again. Through my mask, I could see the brightly coloured coral all around me in the hot tropical waters. I looked up and saw Keaty's legs above me. He was sitting on a rock and had attracted the attention of a little blue fish. It was mainly interested in biting his ankles. I rolled the stones off my lap and let myself float up to the surface. I pinched Keaty's ankle as I passed, using my fingernails like a row of teeth. "Ow! What did you do that for?" said Keaty. "There was this little fish," I laughed. "I thought it was a shark." "There are sharks here?" I asked in surprise. "Millions." He pointed out to the open sea. I pulled myself out of the water and sat next to Keaty on the rock. He started rolling a joint. "How long have you been here?" I said. 2 years. I met Sal in Chiang Mai and we got friendly. We travelled around Thailand a bit together. Then she told me about this place and brought me here." "Tell me about Mr. Duck, Daffy. No one talks about him." "Yeah, people were shocked when they'd heard he'd died," Keaty said. "I didn't really know him. He was a bit distant, to me anyway. I mean, I knew who he was, but we didn't talk much." "So, who was he?" Keaty looked surprised. "You don't know anything, do you, Rich? Haven't you seen the tree yet? The tree by the waterfall? You've been here just over a month." I don't think so." "Man," Keaty smiled. "I'll take you there tomorrow. Then you'll see." "Okay," I said, as he disappeared underwater. That night, just as the light was starting to fade, we were given our seashell necklaces. Sal and her boyfriend Bugs wandered over to where we were sitting and gave them to us. The necklaces were important to me. However friendly everyone was, Etienne, Francoise and I were the only ones without them. Now we'd got them, I felt we'd been officially accepted. I slipped the necklace over my head. Well, thanks a lot, Sal. Thank Bugs. He made yours. Okay, thanks, Bugs. It's a really nice necklace. He nodded, then began walking back to the longhouse. I couldn't make up my mind about Bugs. It was weird, because he was exactly the kind of guy I usually make friends with. But there was something about him that I didn't like. My suntan was progressing well. The sky had been mainly cloudy over the first few days, but now I was getting as brown as I'd ever been. Cool, I said the next day when we were fishing, noticing how dark my skin was. Etienne looked round. What is it? Just my suntan. I'm getting really brown. Etienne nodded. I thought maybe you were thinking of this place. The beach? You said cool, so I thought you were thinking how good it is here. Oh, well, I often think that. I mean, it was worth the trouble, wasn't it? After that long swim and the